Morning, everybody. Yesterday I started this episode and got about 2 minutes in, and people started coming in, and they never stopped. And we had our best day sales wise yesterday, and by a good margin actually. There was a few events in town, team sporting events, baseball and track, and just regulars, and then out of town folks came in, and then we had our second reggae Afrobeat night last night. We had a decent turnout for that. Like, we had probably 15 people come through, which, uh, it's a small town here. And so I'm surprised and pleased by, we got some folks already driving from Rochester, which is, 20, 30 minutes away. But we're getting locals, and some of them, are probably curious. But, a group of them came 2 weeks in a row now, and that's really encouraging. And they brought their daughter, who's a college girl, and she was having the time of her life, it seemed like, and the energy was really good. And I'm tired. It was a 15, 16-hour day yesterday, but we're just building this enterprise, and it's fun. It's a lot of fun. It's great seeing something you envisioned come into fruition. And like I said, we I don't think we doubled our best day, but we certainly added a third onto our best day so far. So that's pretty good. That's pretty great, honestly. Uh, we have the town fair coming up in 5 weeks. I'm guessing that's going to be the new bar. Those days will be crazy, I'm sure, but probably a little less rewarding. Maybe a little more artificially busy because the town has all these people in it, and uh, it'll still be fun, I'm sure. Today I want to talk about jazz. Uh, One of the seminal records, one that most collectors come to fairly early in their hunt, and that's John Coltrane's "A Love Supreme." And you come to Coltrane fairly early on as a jazz collector. I mean, I know for me, I speak for me, but also I've spoken with many others, and many others have concurred. And I know not everyone's path is the same, but most of us come to jazz through Miles, and then Miles, often the Bitches Brew kind of rock and roll fusion era stuff is what we kind of, as rock and roll fans, kind of are exposed to first. And that pushes us back to Coltrane's second quintet and first quintet, and the name Coltrane has a ring to it, so because we've heard of it. And so the next thing we start diving into is some Coltrane. I'm actually getting some dreadlocks again. I used to have long dreadlocks, but my hair's up in a bun so much right now that it's starting to lock up, and I think I'm just gonna let it lock. I don't mind it that way at all. But yeah, hold on one sec. It's a record that, for all its strong legacy, which it definitely has, it's also not the most approachable record. And I've known, and talking to a few people, who found it a difficult listen. And it is intense, and it is frantic at times. It does have a compulsion and an energy to it that's compelling, but it also can be off-putting if you're in a different frame of mind. And so the question I'm kind of posing here is, how accessible do you think "A Love Supreme" is? And it's certainly not Coltrane's most inaccessible work. Far from that. But it's also not My Favorite Things or Ballads or with Johnny Hartman either. It's certainly an intercession. It's certainly an intense prayer to the cosmos, not to anyone's spirituality. It feels very cosmic and very broad in its seeking. And in the right frame of mind, it's an intercession. It's a revelatory piece that enhances all of our existences. Like, he's not just speaking for himself. So yeah, it was a lot of fun last night. But we're talking. I got interrupted here, so I got to get my train of thought back. But Love Supreme, where does it stand in your pantheon? Not of just loved and listened to, But in terms of how accessible is it, how many of you fellas think your wife stays in the room when you play that versus leaves the room? And I'm asking part because I had a friend from the city's come down on Friday, and she was in town most of the weekend, and she asked me to play it for her on Friday night. And Friday night's date night. It's kind of mellow and intimate. And I mean, I'll play different stuff on a Friday night, even, but Love Supreme felt a little bit intense for where I wanted to be, and I don't think she understood that. And I mean, there are some soft passages in A Love Supreme, but a lot of it's fairly more intense than people are accustomed to. Another interruption, but I mean, it's a good problem to have. I guess people clamoring to get in. I'm not even open until 10 o'clock this morning on Sunday, Mother's Day. And it's been 9:15, 9:20. People are clamoring to get in the door. But, so yeah, Love Supreme. I mean, it's a beautiful record. But as I've gotten older, I feel a little bit more when I listen to it that it's more difficult than I initially kind of thought. And I certainly have seen people kind of squinting, and like it's pretty intense. And that's probably the best word for it. It's not difficult. It's not full of screeching and squonking, but it's certainly intense. I mean, and what's emitting from these four men is, it's not like light fodder. It's not like, I'm just sitting at a table having a glass of wine, reminiscing or sharing about some story or telling about some relationship problems, kind of background music. It's much more grabbing the rhino by the horns and wrestling with that monster. And it commands a certain amount of attention and almost respect. But again, it is a little much for certain moments. I think most people could get Love Supreme in the right setting. I mean, if you had a chance to set the table and kind of express what it was about, I think most people, given the frame of mind and the setup, could step into that and be like, wow, this is miraculous stuff. This is deep, this is heavy, this is spiritual, this has a lot of significance and meaning. I think that comes across to even the layman, to even the beginner, to even the non-jazz persona. I think the message in the music has a real intensity and a unified directness. It doesn't feel like it's just four guys out in different places. It's four guys kind of on a vision quest. And I think that comes across fairly clear in the music and in the dynamics of it, and even in the ability of the band to kind of build towards crescendo and reduce towards diminuendo, and to softly enunciate passages, and then to get back to the fiery execution of demons that only Coltrane, to me, in New Thing / Free / the Avant-Garde, only Coltrane, I think, really ignites that fire in me as a listener. I mean, a few other guys dabble, but when I hear some interesting things like The Egg by Herbie Hancock, it doesn't really ignite a fire in me. It's just abstract. And it's a bizarre part of the film. And I think most avant-garde, free, New Thing has limited scope in terms of its listener, in terms of the frame of mind and frame of reference that it's going to put you in, or what it's going to relate to, or how it's going to impact what you think and feel. Love Supreme and Coltrane in general, it's a bit broader. I mean, he's a deep, his sincerity is of the highest, utmost level. And I think that really gives him a credibility and gives him just an integrity, and the listener can really trust that every note that he's about to play, it had to be played. And a lot of these cats don't give you that feeling. A lot of these cats, it just feels like I'm forcing stuff because I think this is what the sound and the genre that I'm going to be delving into is needing me to say. And there's certain players like a Stanley Turrentine who never felt the need to follow down that avenue. And there's other players that felt compelled. I think Rollins really struggles with the movements towards the new thing and the avant-garde and the free jazz. And I think part of his exodus at times was that recognition of not feeling current, but not knowing if that was true to yourself to stay current. And then, interestingly enough, if you guys are fans of the Outkast, the great Atlanta duo who kind of ruled hip hop in the early 2000s, but made a couple classic records in the late 90s, Aquemini, Southern Play, Illicit Cadillac Music, and you got ATLiens, which is Atlanta ATLiens. Those three records to me are seminal hip hop records. And the next two, Love Below Speaker Box and Stankonia, were more commercial crossover records. There was less complete songs. There was more, I felt like, their own production. And that impacted the quality of some of the material. Most of the stuff on Aquemini, from A to Z, it's all great stuff. The Dungeon Family production is really immaculate. The chords are really well orchestrated. The melodies, the harmonies, the background vocals. It's really a well put together record. I think the Source gave it 4 mics or 5 mics. Whatever the top, I think it's 4 mics is the top rating. It's a really great record, Aquemini. And I don't think their next records are that great. They're more commercial, of course, with Hey Ya and some of the stuff on those records. But they're not as good a record all the way through. But anyway, Andre was one of the greatest rappers ever. And his flow and his viscosity and his ability to put intellectual things into a great rhythmic pattern is pretty unrivaled. He's one of the great MCs ever. And he's talking about today how he doesn't have the new cadence, the new sound of the streets. He's an old guy now. He's in his 50s, and people wondering why he's not doing nothing. He's like, I'm not sure I could do with integrity what the young kids are doing, and to not be part of that current sound. Hip-hop's always new to the streets. It's always new to what the young kids are doing. And so I think that's true for a lot of musicians. When the moment you come up and ascend into the mainstream, becomes kind of almost an albatross. And it's hard to reinvent yourself with integrity. It really is. Unless you're kind of the innovator, the pilot, like Coltrane was. Coltrane never was really following anyone's lead. I think he knew what Ornette Coleman was up to. But I never really got the feel that there was a time where I'm like, oh, there's Coltrane trying to sound like Ornette. I mean, I think he grafted some of Ornette's concepts, but very different player, very different motivation, it feels like, behind what Coltrane's doing. And so it's just interesting watching jazz at this point, as it's transitioning and as new sounds are developing. And Coltrane is one of the locomotives pulling that new car. And he's at Impulse. He's making some kind of difficult stuff. Village Vanguard, Africa Brass. He's making some accessible stuff for Impulse to sell. And Love Supreme was kind of this tipping point, it feels like. Crescent, Love Supreme, Quartet Plays. That era is like this golden moment where the sound that Coltrane and the quartet emanates really blossoms into its fullest fruition. It's just a spiritual emblem that you can wear on your heart, and it just connects you with the cosmos. And Love Supreme is like the culmination of that. It's like the piece de la resistance. And he makes some good work after Love Supreme, but it certainly starts to careen more towards I'm running out of time, which he was with health concerns. And the Coltrane Quartet, dissipates. Elvin goes his own way. McCoy goes his own way. Garrison sticks around for a while. And the quartet swells up to like a septet and an octet at times. And Alice ends up in the group. And the whole spiritual jazz name, which was never something they really applied to it. Again, it's scholars that like to kind of brand things. But, I mean, jazz is spiritual from its very beginnings. If you don't feel the spirit of Louis Armstrong when he's playing, you are spiritually dead. if you're not feeling the spiritual connection with Ellington and his sacred music and that compositional genius, you're spiritually far from woke. And the music's been a spiritual barometer of the people for multiple generations. So to kind of discredit all that came before the spiritual jazz phenomenon as not being spiritual, I mean, boy, you're really not hearing jazz. Or you've heard a lot of the wrong shit. And I just thought it'd be an interesting record to talk about a little bit. I've talked about Love Supreme before, obviously. But it's a new way to look at it. How accessible do you think it is? And do your friends love it or walk out of the room? Does your wife love it or walk out of the room? And ultimately, that's kind of a barometer that's more objective than our own acceptance of the art. Because for most of us, as I've said many times, once we buy it, we decided we loved it. And so we spent that $30. We're going to come and love this shit no matter what the fuck it is. And it takes having bought 500 records that you're like, man, I'm not sure I really like this shit, for you're finally willing to go, man, I don't have to like all these records. I love some of them I'm like, not my thing. And that objectivity takes time. It takes honesty. It takes a willingness to face derision from others who spent $60 on that record. Like, no, you have to love it. It's amazing. It's classic. I love it. Well, enough said. So, again, where do you stand on Love Supreme? And we're not talking about how great a record it is or how important it is. That's not up for debate. The only question we're debating here right now is how accessible is it? And, of course, there's the 4 parts, and each part has maybe a different degree of accessibility. But, I don't know. Tell me what you think and how you feel about that shit. I think it's an important piece of music, obviously, and one that I play frequently. And tell me what your wife thinks when you play it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed. We're trying to be one of the coolest channels on the internet when it comes to talking about jazz. I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there nowadays, but we're trying to keep it real and talk about the music and just the history of it and the emotional impact that it makes on us and how it makes us feel. Like, I think that stuff's the most important part of any artist's work, is the dynamic of how it connects with us. And so it's fun to talk pressings and reissues and all that stuff, and we're going to let most of the other channels do that. If you want jazz content that's about the music, the Jazz Shepherd's where to go. And if you ever want to have fun, have a great week, you come up to the Jazz Shepherd Cafe, coffee shop. It's a fun place. I'm going to throw a few videos from what we were doing this weekend just so people can kind of see how it's starting to build into something fun. We're just scratching the surface. I mean, we're in a small town. We had maybe 14, 15 people in the room at any one time at the most, you know. So it's still very much in the beginning nucleus. But this room is just small enough that you get a dozen, you get a dozen people and it feels like you got a little scene, you know. And so when you get to 10, 12, 14, 15 people in the room, it's like, oh, this is nice. This is nice. And so we're going to build it around Afro beats and reggae, but we're going to throw hip-hop and R&B in the mix as well. It's going to be a fun night. So if you're in the area, come on, check it out. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace. You know the